So I guess the first point to make is that actually, for the first time ever, we're not talking about carbon,
Right.
which has been a big focus, I know, for the last
Yeah.
decade or more in terms of businesses sort of meeting environmental obligations. We're talking just about biodiversity, which I think is also
Ah.
really exciting. But biodiversity is a proxy for all of these other environmental benefits, including carbon.
Hello, I'm Sumit Bose. Welcome to the Net Hero podcast. This podcast is for you if you're interested in business and reducing our carbon footprint. Our belief is that better business leads to a better planet. Who wouldn't want to make things that have less impact on our society? It's a podcast for people who are inventors, academics, people working in the energy sector, or from any different field that believe that they can do something better to make the products and services we use every day less harmful. Now, we've been running for about 3 years and it's been very successful with about 36,000 downloads and plenty more, massive engagement. But this show now needs a sponsor. We've done it editorially for all these years, but we need your help. So we know you've got a loyal audience out there. If you'd like to get involved and sponsor the show, then email me on the email just below on your screen. And we'd like to see if you're the right fit for us and that you've got the same vision we have. Now, on to this week's episode. I'd like a bank and I'd like a green bank. That's what everyone says. But today's episode will unveil something slightly different because the Net Hero podcast this week is talking about something that people have been sort of rumouring about. Natural capital, that's the term, or kind of biodiversity net gain. i.e., can we try and do less damage by growing green things or taking fields or growing woods and using nature to help us undo some of the bad things we've been doing? Well, there's an organisation called the Environment Bank, which has been doing exactly that. It's British, it's headquartered up in York, and I'm delighted to say, I've never heard this job title before, which is a brilliant job title, but I'm joined by the Chief Ecology Officer, you heard that right, Emma Toovey. Hello, Emma.
Hi, great to meet you, and thank you so much for inviting me on today.
I love it. I've never heard many CEOs I've met, but not one that's called the Chief Ecology Officer.
Not many of them, but I highly recommend every board having one.
Every board should have one. Right, so let's clear it up. Environment Bank isn't a bank as such, is it? So exactly what is it?
Absolutely. So we're not we don't hold financial capital. Actually, what we hold is natural capital assets. So essentially we're a nature recovery business. So we are developing a unique network of landscape scale nature restoration projects all across England at the moment. We work with the rural community, rural landowners. We take land that has low biodiversity value and we create these incredible nature recovery projects on them, which add biodiversity value to the landscape.
Can I just stop you there? What is biodiversity value? What does that mean to our audience?
So biodiversity is essentially the diversity of living things.
So not just like a field of corn, you're talking about lots of different plants. Is that what it means in simple terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So different types of habitats, different types of species. The more variety we have, the more healthy our landscapes are. It's essentially bringing nature back into our landscape. So you talk about a cornfield. Essentially, it's a golden desert of wildlife. There's not a lot that can live within a cornfield, and that's hurting us in terms of not having a healthy planet. So we're trying to bring back more life into our landscape.
Just before we go into what you're doing, I just want to get to the central point of this. Why does that matter? Because people would say, we've been farming for thousands of years, and there's hedgerows, and you go to different areas in the world, they've got different, woods and things that they leave wild. What does it matter about kind of, this biodiversity? Because the fact is we're growing plants, aren't we? Whether we're growing rape or corn or wheat or whatever, they are all plants. They all use CO2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's quite hard to kind of get your head around it a bit. But essentially, I mean, the UK is one of the most depleted countries globally for biodiversity, which is quite shocking when you go out and about into the countryside. You think, oh, it's so green and pleasant lands. Yeah. But actually, there's no diversity in our landscapes. And what diversity brings is healthy soil. It brings opportunities to create clean water. It helps us clean our air. It creates pollination services. So lots more bees and bugs means that we can grow more food. And all of these, what we call ecosystem services, they help us as a society thrive. And without them, we impact on our ability not just to live healthy lives, but also it hugely impacts on our economy.
But
So,
but you
yeah.
just said it there. It's known as the green and pleasant land, right? You go to anywhere, you get Scotland, Wales, England. Farmland looks amazing. Countryside looks amazing. You hear birds. I can't think what you said there. Sounds quite shocking that we've got low biodiversity.
Yeah, and more than 40% of species in the UK have declined since the 1970s. It's actually shocking how much. And I think
Wow.
there's this other thing called shifting baseline syndrome, is that we don't know what we've lost because we've got used to having less bumps, less insects being squashed on our windscreens.
Now that is true. When I used to drove around in the 70s and 80s, I remember my Ford Escort, loads of bugs. Hardly any
Yeah,
these days. Yeah.
that's it. Exactly.
And
That's
and
it.
is that to do with what our farming or urbanized? What's the reason?
Well, there's a huge number of factors, but primarily it's about habitat loss and destruction of our core habitat. So that's as a result of certainly farming, and certain policies in farming, that have led to incentivizing food production over the protection of nature. Other factors are indeed urban development, so the sprawling of our cities and continued development and not mitigating and compensating for the impacts associated with development. And really that leads into kind of our core business. I'm right now at Environment Bank is trying to address some of that loss of habitat and reverse that decline in nature.
How long's the bank been going?
So we're actually, our founder, Professor David Hill, he set up the business in the mid to late noughties, 2007. So we've
Right.
been going for well over a decade. And in those days, we were a pure consultancy. And what we were doing was trying to facilitate for developers opportunities to deliver environmental benefits off-site. So outside of their development projects, whether it was housing, a new power plant, there's always been a requirement on developers to deliver some environmental
Okay.
mitigation.
Right.
And so we were a facilitator. So we'd work with rural landowners and the developer and essentially bring them together and negotiate a deal to deliver long-term environmental benefits. In doing that, we learned a lot, and we learned that it's incredibly hard, and also that the long-term sort of success of those projects was always really hard to secure. And so many times, often, project after project, they failed because there wasn't a really good governance and a strong statutory regime that underpinned them, that made sure that those environmental promises were actually delivered on the ground.
So there wasn't anyone really checking.
No one
Yeah.
checking, no regulation of sort of
So
infrastructure
I
around
promised to
those
say, right, I'm
projects.
going to build a housing estate, and by the way, there's 5 acres. I'm going to put some scrubland, but I didn't. Or I'm going to create an area for owls or something, and I didn't.
Indeed, or they plant the scrub and plant the trees, and then they skip away and forget to look after them for the promised 25 years or whatever it was.
So how does it work at present then? You talked about, you initially worked with developers and they didn't keep up their end of the bargain, or other people. So what are you doing now? And is it that you're working with farmers who've got like fallow land, or is it that you work with people who say, oh, I'm going to develop, and you help them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it's really important to just touch on how we've come about really in our change in business model in the last few years is as a result of new regulations, new laws that came in
Right.
February this year. And that's created a market for nature assets, if you like, what are called biodiversity units. Now, there's a new regulation that came in called Biodiversity Net Gain, which you touched on at the beginning of the session, and that requires developers, pretty much all developers in England, to deliver a net gain in biodiversity value as a result of their development scheme.
Ah, okay. So not just repair a bit, but actually make it better than it was before.
exactly. And there's a statutory requirement on them, which means that they
Right.
have to do it. And there's a sort of a level of enforcement that wraps around that makes sure that they do. So developers that they have to seek to deliver as much as they possibly can on site, on the development sites themselves, in terms of
Yeah.
biodiversity value. But if they can't, which in many cases they're unable to do, they're able to seek off-site opportunities, for
Gotcha.
example, working with the Environment Bank. So we're delivering these incredible nature recovery projects all across England, with working with local landowners, and what we're able to do is measure the additional biodiversity value that we're delivering on the ground, and that translates into units.
Let me stop you there because this is all really good. So I can sort of understand it. I want to make sure the audience follows it. So I get it. So I'm a developer. I'm going to build some houses down in, the southeast, say, and I need as much stock. Yeah. So I want to, and I'll say, right, maybe 10th of the site I'll use for some hedging, but I've got to get more bio and net gain. So I then come to you and go, actually, Emma, I need to offset all the carbon or whatever it's going to be from these houses. How do you work out? So basic questions. Do you work out how much carbon a development would use in building it or running it? And then how do you translate that into how much carbon you'd have to get back? And how do you determine the biodiversity? Because I can imagine carbon's
Yeah.
quite easy because you can say this many plants does this many things. But,
Mm-hmm.
if an area had no spiders and you've got to put 4,000 spiders in it, how you do
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing. So I guess the first point to make is that actually, for the first time ever, we're not talking about carbon,
Right.
which has been a big focus, I know, for the last
Yeah.
decade or more in terms of businesses sort of meeting environmental obligations. We're talking just about biodiversity, which I think is also
Ah,
really exciting. But biodiversity is a proxy for all of these other environmental benefits, including carbon. But we're really lucky because the government have been developing a calculator, basically, at what's called the biodiversity metric. It's literally a spreadsheet, but it's wonderful because it creates this level playing field. So the developers use it, the ecological consultants and planners that support the developers use it, the landowners use it, we as operators use it. So we all are using the same tool, which
right.
is really important because there's this level playing field.
And what does it say? So explain it to me, this spreadsheet. Does it say
So
5 meters squared is 400 caterpillars, 26 butterflies,
So
and a
we only
bat?
look at, yeah, almost not too far off. And we say we only look at habitats. So
Right.
habitats is again a proxy for nature as a whole.
Okay.
And we look at the types of habitats, and then we look at the quality of those habitats and how much area of those habitats is present. So we calculate what's there at the beginning before the development happens.
Right.
We calculate what's there at the end after the development happens.
Yeah.
And where there's a differential, then they might need to buy additional
Ah,
units
got you.
off site. So it
Got
gives a
you.
score. It basically breaks it down into a score of units for each of those things.
Can you give an example of in the real world so people can understand? Like, you say me, I don't. You don't have to name names, but a site and how do you worked out the biodiversity in the beginning, and then this difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples, but I can think of one, a project that I worked on myself. I mean, often housing developments, they're located on not super high value biodiversity land, but there might be a modified grassland or
Yeah.
essentially a piece of grassland that has some biodiversity value surrounded by hedgerows, a little
Yeah.
pocket of woodland. So an ecologist would go out, they'd map that, they'd survey it, they'd literally get down on their hands and knees, look at the plants
Oh
that are
wow.
present within those habitats, and that helps them categorize what's present on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then using the master plan for the development scheme, they're able to then also predict what types of habitats and their quality you'd get at the end of that process once the development's been delivered. And that differential gives them a score. It says, okay, this developer, a recent housing developer, they actually did some incredible enhancements on site itself. There was a nice little country park, but they were still short because actually the quality of the grassland beforehand was quite good. So there was a residual need for about 50 biodiversity units, and so they needed to seek delivery of that outside of the development scheme itself, and that's when they come to us and we can help them with that.
So, what in this example, and as I said, you don't have to give names. How many homes were they building? What was the land like? And then where did they go and get these other units from?
Yeah, so I mean, in this example, I think there are about 150 residential units,
Right.
and the starting point was it was rural. It was a greenfield site in a rural area where the biodiversity wasn't super high, but there was some value there. So they recognized they would need to do something. So they had this residual need to meet the planning requirements. They needed to find an operator, and they came to us, and they needed to deliver some hedgerow units
Yep.
and some grassland units. And we had a local project, one of our nature recovery projects, where we'd already got things going on the ground because all of our projects are forward funded by our funders, which I can talk to you about in a second. And there's always already stuff happening. So we've already banked the units, if you like, that were then able to sell to the developer to meet their planning application requirements and get them started on the ground.
So does that mean that they bought hedgerows that already existed, or they bought land and then you planted hedgerows, for example?
So under our model, we'll get going. We're able to get going on our projects and kickstart them on the ground, do lots of capital works, plant the hedgerows and the trees and seed the grassland. But actually, what they're in other models, there needs to be a legal commitment to do that, and it needs to be wrapped up and committed to legally in order for them to be kind of a viable purchase, if you like.
So how often is it local? Say I'm building something in Rotherham. Would it be that the land is in Exeter that I do this thing, or does it have to be local? Because that's another thing I'm trying to work out. You know, if I'm a developer up there, obviously people go, "What are you doing?" And then you go, "Well, by the way, we've built this, but it's down, 200 miles away."
It's such an important question because it's kind of core to the principle of offsetting, is that you should be delivering the mitigation as close to the impact as possible. And it's so core, like if we ever lose sight of that, then it really does become a license to trash. BNG isn't a license to trash. It really isn't. There's a clear hierarchy of decision making that needs to be made. So they have to consider all options, exhaust all options on site first. Then they have to exhaust all options in the local area.
Yep.
And if at that point they're not able to deliver the mitigation locally, which is in the local planning authority area or what's called a national character area, then they can go beyond. They can look at adjacent and national. But that's a last resort. They have to go through that process.
So you're trying to get them as local as possible, yeah.
Yeah, and they're incentivized to do that, yeah.
How do you value these things? So you talked about you actually get down on your hands and knees, you count the daffodils or the bluebells or, I don't know, ladybirds or whatever it is. Is there a figure then that says, right, that land is 5 units of biodiversity or that one is 10? And how much is a unit worth? Because at the end of the day, this is all about money. You've got to have money to plant these things. You've got money to buy the seed, haven't you?
Absolutely, and it's so important that we reward the stewards of the land for looking after them. They have to make a commitment to do that for at least 30 years.
Wow.
So they need to have that funding security in place. Yep. And that's the new requirement of the law. So different habitat types yield a different number of units.
Okay. So give me an example.
So if you've got what's a medium distinctiveness grassland, which means like a pretty good diverse wildflower meadow.
Okay.
But not the optimum, not the like super rare and special, but something really solid, really, really good. That's what we call medium distinctiveness. And that can yield anything sort of about 7 to 10 units per hectare. Whereas if you've got something a bit more special, like a really mature woodland.
Yes, I was going to say.
Which needs decades and decades to really become that, high, we call it high distinctiveness, really special, very rare. Actually, the yield of units there is lower, and that's trying to recognize the fact that it's harder to deliver that. It's very special. Don't do this without thinking it through, making sure that you're giving the habitats the time to develop. And that's near about 2 units per hectare, where you enhance existing woodland, very mature woodland.
How much does it cost? Is there an actual value agreed by everyone, or is it a government set figure?
Yeah, so there's no market pricing levels, and they are determined by the operators themselves. But it's again a really important point, because it's important that the long-term maintenance and management of those habitats is taken into account in the cost of a unit. So a grassland unit is sort of around the £30,000 per unit mark, give or take a bit, but then some other habitats that need a lot more management and attention, they could be more expensive. So, and we also have to building costs for contingency and monitoring. We have to build in costs.
So it's a real proper investment, and that's where the term bank comes from, I assume, for what you're trying to do as well. That brings that together. When you're doing this, it's a bit like, the viewers and listeners will know about, power contracts, PPAs, which is like, I'll do 25 years and you'll offset my stuff. Or people will think about the old-fashioned offsetting. You've got to make sure that land can be looked after for those 30 years. And you've got to make sure that funding is there. So what I'm trying to get is, you might get a company that starts all right, goes bust in 5 years' time. What happens to that legacy land then?
Yeah, so again, really, almost the governance around delivery of biodiversity net gain is as important as the ecology bit, right, to make sure it actually happens. So all biodiversity net gain sites that are used to meet as a compliance kind of project for the new laws, they have to be bound through law for the purpose of nature conservation for at least that 30 years.
Okay.
It's overseen either by the local planning authority or by what's called a responsible body, which is another kind of competent organisation that can do that. And that's where the teeth are. They're able to enforce, they're able to oversee. There's a requirement for an operator like us to continually monitor and report back and tell them what's going on. So there is that third party there to keep things on track.
I like this, but people would say very, on the very left of green elements, that this is just greenwashing in another way. You're letting people develop, and then you're going, I'm going to plant a few flowers or stick some bees in there, and that will be it. And which has always been the criticism for people offsetting anyway. How do you respond to people saying, well, you're just allowing greenwashing in a different way?
I mean, I totally disagree with that. I think, if anything, this new regime brings a lot more rigor to environmental impact. We're essentially addressing environmental impacts in a really transparent, really quantitative way. There's a very clear way that those impacts have to be measured and then compensated for. And there's a really robust kind of governance regime that sits around that. So we're in this pickle in terms of nature depletion in this country, because we haven't had a system like this. And, back to that kind of hierarchy of decision making, that is key to ensuring it's not that license to trash. And we have to do it. And because we're using this metric that does it in a really transparent way, it ensures that the developer actually does have to deliver. So I think, it also facilitates development. It ensures sustainable development, and it gives certainty to developers. So actually the development sector like it, because prior to this, there's a lot of professional judgment, a lot of greyness, and a lot of uncertainty around ecological issues on projects.
Before we go, a couple of quick points. Let's talk about the issue, as you said there, of kind of, I get it where you've been. How does any of this apply to brownfield sites? I assume it doesn't, because frankly, it's a city, you've knocked down a factory and you rebuild it. That wouldn't be an example, would it, or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because actually a lot of our brownfield sites, particularly where they've been left unused for a number of years,
yeah, exactly,
they become these wildlife havens.
Exactly.
Some of the best examples of habitats, particularly for invertebrate.
Just have a look around here. Exactly.
In London, in East London, there's so many incredible sites because they've been abandoned and left and allowed to rewild.
They're technically brownfield, aren't they?
Yeah, but it still applies. So
it still
there are
applies.
very, very few exemptions. So only very small scale developments, less than 9 dwellings, or less than, basically small scale impacts on biodiversity are exempt. But the vast majority of planning applications.
So if you had an old factory 20 years ago, it was knocked down and it's now full of wildflowers and foxes and all of that, and even if it's in the middle of, back end of Leighton where I used to live, it'll still count as biodiversity, yes?
Yeah, that's it.
Wow.
It still counts, and the new laws apply.
The last point I want to talk about is obviously we've had a change of government, and old Ange at Labour wants to build and build and build. And that's all great. People want to go and have the housing crisis looked at. But there's a lot of concern about what this will do. What it used to be called, I think it's called CPRE, but it used to be called Countryside Protection Ruling, but they've changed the name, whatever. Other groups have said, whoa, we've got to be very careful that we don't have, unrestricted, just a go for building, madness that could really affect our environment. Where do you, as an organisation, sit on this? Because if everything's to be believed, that there'll be a real ramp up of development over the next few years, and a real clamour to do it quickly.
Yeah, and Labour have shown that there is a real appetite for scaling up housing development very quickly, but they've also shown a real commitment for sustainable development, and there's absolutely no signs that the biodiversity net gain regime will be lost, and in fact they support it hugely. So from my perspective, biodiversity net gain is coming at a perfect time, because it is a statutory requirement that really enables a sustainable way forward, a way to ensure that if we want to scale development quickly, we can do it in a sustainable, measured and transparent way. So we think BNG is good for facilitating good quality development that thinks about nature and is mindful of nature, rather than the opposite, which is where we've been perhaps for the last multiple decades.
The last thing, there are people listening who are developers, fine, it works for them. But what if you're a business, and a lot of our audience are businesses, and they think, oh, I quite like the idea of this, but I'm not building houses, I'm just, I've got an office block, or I'm doing something like that. Is there any way someone like that can get involved in this? Or even just they're wanting to watch what they're doing with their carbon, and they're trying to sort of readjust, and traditionally go and do an offset. Does any of this biodiversity net gain apply to them?
Absolutely. I think what the biodiversity net gain regime is bring some robustness to nature recovery projects. And we talk about good governance, we talk about nature recovery, and actually it's a really good place for corporates, organisations that are thinking about a sort of nature positive investment that sits outside the development regime, as you rightly say. It gives them a safe space to invest because it's super robust. So the direction of travel is that there'll be increasing pressures on organisations to sort of understand, measure and disclose their impacts on nature through their value chains, not related to biodiversity net gain, but more around financial disclosures. And the BNG regime sort of gives a great opportunity for them to start to address those in a really safe way that manages greenwashing risk as well.
Do you enjoy your job?
I love it. I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it for the world.
I can tell you're very enthused by it. I feel that, and it's one of those things that I suppose we don't really think about, do we? We don't think about what's there in front of us, because we always go on a safari to see some wildlife, and I suppose maybe I've got a little one, and they took him for a little thing like mini beasts. They used to be called creepy crawlies when I was a kid, but now they're called mini beasts. But it was like fascinating. They go, oh look, there's a woodlouse. I'm thinking it's just a pest that lives in my house.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there some sort of re-education you think that this might do as well for us?
It's a hugely exciting time to be an ecologist. I highly recommend it as a career choice right now. Nature is trending, as they say, like it very much is becoming mainstream conversation, not just in society or people that like bird watching or following butterflies. It's actually being discussed at board level in organisations, because they understand that there's this dependency that we have on nature that we need to recognise and think about when we're making decisions in the economy. Education is absolutely key. We're seeing how impactful that is already, and young people that are coming into the workforce, they really do care about that, and they're putting pressure on their employers to think about nature, and they want to see that being addressed. So very much really key.
Emma, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me.
No problem. Thanks so much.
No, it's been great. So there you go. The first ever Chief Ecology Officer we've had on the podcast. It's always
Hopefully not the last.
Not the last. I'm going to make sure I'm going to find some others. Dear audience, tell me what you think about this. I think it's a great idea because it's doing something which is local, which is the big problem with loads of offsetting. It's doing something that's doing something slightly different. And it's, as Emma said, away from the word carbon. So tell us your views, get in touch on social media, or if you want to be on the podcast, email us nethero@futurenetzero.com. See you next time.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.